No single crime has ever caught the public's imagination quite like Jack the Ripper. Few crimes in history have led to more conspiracy theories and conjecture. The Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard dates back to 1874 and houses artefacts and evidence collected over 2 centuries of crime. Many of the exhibits have made history, furthering developments in forensic science or cornering some of Britain's most notorious criminals. These items have rarely been touched, many have never been seen since they made their journey from courtroom to crime museum. There's early fingerprint evidence, blood typing, DNA advancements, and an arsenal of guns, knives, and poisons. Jack the Ripper was responsible for 5 deaths of mostly prostitutes in a small and seedy part of London over 100 years ago, but spawned a fascination which is just as great today. The truth may be less fanciful than many of the theories. This book, by a police chief of the time, contains notes from the investigator. It's only recently been discovered and been donated to the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard. Jack the Ripper has spawned countless myths since his chilling crimes in 1888. He was known as the Whitechapel murderer then, but if anything, his notoriety has grown over the years, and those privileged few who've had access to the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard are drawn to the tantalising clues that are still stored here. There have been dozens of Jack the Ripper suspects. Some of the theories are well researched, some stretch the facts, and some can't be taken seriously at all. George Chapman murdered 3 women and was hanged for his crimes in 1903. He broadly fitted the descriptions of men seen walking with the Ripper victims and had medical skills to perform the mutilations. But his methods were quite different. He was a poisoner, not a strangler. A Russian doctor and convict named Mikhail Ostrog was a homicidal maniac and said to have been cruel to women. He was known to have carried surgical knives and other instruments, but there's nothing to link him directly to the Ripper's crimes. Among the more fantastical conspiracy theories is one that points the finger at Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, though it's hard to believe he could ever have been at home in one of the poorest and grimmest parts of London. Only recently has new evidence come to light from the actual officers who investigated the Ripper's crimes. It's preserved here in the Crime Museum, New Scotland Yard. 1888. Queen Victoria had recently celebrated her Golden Jubilee. Britain was at the peak of its global power, with the greatest navy, the greatest factories, the greatest wealth on earth. But there still remained huge class divides.
London was at this time the heart of the empire. It was very rich, it was a very prosperous city. But for the East End of London, this was outcast London, unwanted London. And so you have this very large Jewish population on the east side of the city, crammed into overcrowded houses, stinking slums and tenements, and living on the edge of tremendous poverty.
Unemployment was endemic, and with work at the East End so hard to find, many families were desperate, doing whatever they could to make a living.
Children suffered very, very badly. Over 55% of children in the East End of London at this time were dead before the age of 5. The men earned their living down at the docks. They could get work. The women earned money sewing sacks, making buttonholes to clothing, sweatshop clothing, working 17, 18 hours a time.
But for women who couldn't find a job, there was another option. There were so many prostitutes, competition for business was intense.
They're out on the street, they're desperate, and to give you some idea of value, the prices the women fetched or earned was not very great. You're looking at 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread. That's how low the value was on these women's bodies.
Polly Ann Nichols was one of those women relying on her body for income. In the early hours of Friday, the 31st of August, 1888, she left the Frying Pan public house in Brick Lane and went back to her lodgings. When she arrived, the landlord demanded his rent and turned her away. Nichols left, saying she'd be able to earn the money in no time, working on the streets. A few hours later, she was dead in Bucks Row. Her throat had been slashed and there were deep lacerations to her abdomen. It was the beginning of a murder spree that was to last 10 weeks and take the lives of 4 more women.
The murders come almost out of nowhere, taking place in a killing ground, which at most is a walk of 15 minutes across.
A week later, and half a mile away from the first murder in Bucks Row, a second body was discovered. It was another prostitute, Annie Chapman, found on Hanbury Street at 5:50 in the morning of Saturday, September the 8th. Again, her throat had been slit and her abdomen cut open. A double murder inside 9 days was unheard of and generated mass interest in the public and the press. Hundreds of letters were sent to the police and local press purporting to be written by the killer. Most of them were taken to be fakes, either by journalists trying to get a story or fools trying to arouse more terror. But every letter was read, and one caught the eye of the police, and with an invented name, it caught everyone's imagination. It read,
"Dear boss, I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper."
The letter was almost certainly a hoax, but from this moment on, the killer would be known as Jack the Ripper. And the Ripper was about to strike again, twice in one night. On the 30th of September, the night after the letter had been received, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were discovered with their throats slit. Elizabeth was found in Berners Street at 1 a.m. and police assumed the Ripper must have been disturbed and fled the scene before performing his usual mutilations. She'd only had her throat cut. Catherine was discovered by P.C. Watkins 3/4 of an hour later in Mitre Square. But this time, Jack the Ripper had had time to slash his victim all over her face and body. Hysteria spread as the public heard details of the barbaric nature of the crimes.
The press coverage of the Jack the Ripper's murders was absolutely enormous. There were illustrated papers, magazines, yards and yards of newsprint detailing the investigation. So you have the story gathering a tremendous momentum as the investigation goes on. The women are terrified that Jack is going to choose one of them as a victim.
The police were under tremendous pressure, and next day, the 31st of September, a crowd gathered on Berners Street to protest at the continuation of the murders. But outrage wasn't going to stop them.
What's not often recognised is how handicapped the Victorian policemen were by the lack of forensic sort of skills. I mean, there's no blood grouping, there's no fingerprints, there's no DNA. All of these things are lacking, things which you would use in a modern day investigation. And so a lot of the police work depends upon sort of, then as it does now, on a lot of good legwork, statement taking, and just routine sometimes painstaking but plodding detective work to bring somebody to justice.
And though the killing seemed so brazen out on the streets of London for all to see, in fact, there were no direct sightings and few witnesses at all.
Killings taking place at the weekend, the traders who would have been these women's customers are not about. So the streets are very much sort of deserted. You don't have too many people out on them. And those who are out on the streets are very much homeless and prostitutes.
The Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was Robert Anderson. But Anderson was on vacation during most of the investigation. So he placed Chief Inspector Donald Swanson in overall charge. Swanson was freed from all other duties and given his own office in Scotland Yard from which to coordinate inquiries. He was given permission to see every document, every report, and every telegram concerning the investigation. But it turned out that the huge mass of paperwork was vague, unsatisfactory, or contradictory. And almost a century before anyone had thought of forensic psychology as a formal science, Jack the Ripper seemed quite incomprehensible.
He is a trophy hunter. He is killing and collecting body parts. I mean, the murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. With policemen coming in and out of the square, you're looking at a killing time of about 4 to 5 minutes. He is working with tremendous speed in acquiring his trophies. He has a natural arrogance. He knows what he wants to do, and he's quite confident of doing it, whether the police are there to stop him or not. I mean, this is a trademark of many killers, an arrogance that they can do these crimes and actually sort of get away with it.
It was now 6 weeks since the first body had been discovered. There'd been no arrests, and with the press fueling fear, Londoners anticipated another Ripper attack. 10 days had passed since the double murder on the 30th of September. The landlord at 13 Miller's Court peered through the window of his tenant's bedroom, hoping to collect the rent. Then the most gruesome of all the discoveries, the appallingly mutilated body of Mary Jane Kelly. It was the Ripper at his most barbaric, and it seemed nothing could stop him before he struck again. This is the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard. It's home to the world's largest collection of crime scene artefacts. In fact, only a select few have ever viewed these fascinating and sometimes rather macabre objects. But now with our exclusive access, we can show you many of the secrets within. The East End of London in the late 19th century was poor, overcrowded, and rife with prostitution. Over the course of 6 weeks in 1888, a serial killer went on a spree. 4 women were found with their throats cut on the streets of Whitechapel. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer, and women lived in fear. The murderer was dubbed Jack the Ripper. Then, on the 9th of November, a ghastly discovery brought the tally of the Ripper to 5. This victim, also a prostitute, was Mary Jane Kelly, found in her lodgings in Miller's Court. How was Mary Jane Kelly found?
Mary Kelly was found by the landlord sending his man round to the house to ask Kelly for the rent. She was behind with the payment. And so he went round to the room, knocked on the door, no answer. Knowing that the window panes were broken at the side, he went round to the side of the room, pushed out the rags and newspaper in the broken panes, and then looking through, that's when he saw the body lying on the bed.
He must have been pretty shocked by what he saw.
He was absolutely appalled, and so was everyone else who saw the body.
Mary Jane Kelly had been cut and slashed with almost ritualistic brutality. This was the attack that led conspiracy theorists to believe the killer was a surgeon, though the injuries were far cruder than that. And this time, though the killer wasn't seen, witnesses had heard what happened.
Mary Jane Kelly had had 2 customers that night, and the murderer, the Ripper, was the second of the customers. And she took him into her room, and around about 3:30 in the morning, there's people nearby hear a faint cry of murder. It's almost...
She's cried murder?
She's cried murder. It's almost certainly at this point that the murderer, lying on the bed beside her, has thrown the sheet over her head and made his first thrust through the sheet with his knife.
The killer, I mean, was obviously, well, we would say mentally deranged now. I mean, there was something plainly sort of not right with him. How would forensic psychologists describe him today?
I don't know how forensic psychologists would describe him. Obviously, the assumption would be that they were insane, but what I do think he has in common with other murderers is he has an arrogance.
The room in which Mary Kelly was murdered was tiny, with other residents close by. There were broken windows with paper covering the holes. And had the Ripper been disturbed, there would have been nowhere for him to run.
So that is in itself is tremendous arrogance in the fact that he is actually spending several hours with the body.
Arrogance, or maybe just madness. At any rate, an indifference to being seen or caught. The Metropolitan Police discovered that Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes died, was patrolled every 15 minutes by the City Police. So Jack the Ripper had continued to mutilate Catherine, even as a police officer walked past no more than 20 yards away. It was a bitterly frustrating time for the investigating detectives. They were under intense scrutiny, but lacked any decent evidence about any individual. They drew up lists of suspects and made arrests, but more in hope than expectation. Officially at least, the Metropolitan Police never found the culprit. Donald Swanson never got his man. To this day, the fascination is about who did it. Here in the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard, one of the few things that has survived are the memoirs of Sir Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time of the killings, and 20 years later he wrote his memoirs called The Lighter Side of My Official Life. He gave a copy to the Chief Investigating Officer of the Ripper crimes, Donald Swanson. Swanson read the book and scribbled his own notes in the margin. He named his chief suspect as a local barber, Aaron Kosminski. But he explained that he'd never been arrested because a prime witness of the murder of Elizabeth Stride refused to inform on Kosminski as a fellow Jew. Assistant Commissioner Anderson had originally written, "This witness was the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer," to which Swanson had added in the margin, "Because the suspect was also a Jew, and also because his evidence would convict the suspect, it would mean the murderer being hanged. He did not wish this to be left on his mind." But the barber, Aaron Kosminski, did have cutting implements. He was thought to have had strong homicidal tendencies and a malice towards women, and he was certified insane. And according to the book, Kosminski had been picked out of an identity parade. But that evidence was not enough, and he had to be let go. Swanson added in the margin, "On suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police day and night. In a very short time, with his hands tied behind his back, he was sent to the workhouse and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect." Once Anderson had read what Swanson had scribbled in his book, he too became an advocate of the Kosminski theory. But not all the experts agree that Anderson was right. In this copy, the investigating officer of the murders, Donald Swanson, has made it clear that the killer was a local Polish Jew, and that he was very mad. He eventually died in a lunatic asylum, and they're absolutely convinced it was this chap called Kosminski. You're not convinced at all of this?
Not at all. This book was published, as I say, in 1910, 22 years after the murders. Now, Robert Anderson, for most of the Jack the Ripper investigation, he is not there, not on the scene when most of the Ripper murders take place. So what Anderson gets is almost certainly what has been fed to him by Swanson. The policemen at the time who were the investigators, Alma Street, none of them agree with Anderson.
But Swanson also scribbled in the margins of Anderson's book this telling sentence: "And after this identification, which suspects knew, no other murder of this kind took place in London." Maybe Kosminski, being poor and certified insane, is just too dull to compete with much more colourful theories. At any rate, most Ripper historians reject it. As far as you're concerned, it remains unsolved. Mm-hmm. But what about the historians, sometimes not historians so much as fiction writers who've turned their attention to this, who've come up with some really extraordinary ideas about who might have done it, including royalty and members of the peerage and artists and all sorts of things.
But then one takes it as fiction. Who he was, we just don't know.
Who do you think did it then?
Geographical profiling puts him within about 200 yards of the Mary Kelly killing. I think he was a local man. I do think he was somebody like a butcher or a slaughterman. And I have this image of this man standing there with a butcher's smock, heavily bloodstained, with the victim's blood on it, standing there in a crowd and thoroughly enjoying the spectacle and thinking, I did all this. And I think that is possibly what Jack the Ripper did, that he enjoyed the spectacle and realized and enjoyed the terror that he'd actually created.
If Kosminski was the killer, perhaps the whole world has gone a little mad, inflating the significance of the murders, exaggerating the surgical precision of the attacks, inventing far-fetched connections to improbably famous men, and expanding the number of victims from 5 to, well, some say 11. And whoever he was almost certainly not called Jack. But there's no doubting the enormity of his crimes and the impact they had on contemporary London. And maybe his 5th killing really did justify his infamy. The murder and mutilation of Mary Kelly in November 1888 was of such ferocity that for once it left the press short of superlatives. And eventually it led to the resignation of the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It seems that fascination with the Ripper will never really die. Why should it? Like all the best mysteries, it can never now be solved. For 130 years, the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard has been archiving the tools, the relics and the instruments of the most notorious killers, the most infamous conmen, the most audacious of thieves. Nowadays, it's a training ground for police and judiciary, but it's also a sombre reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and a tribute to the triumphs of Scotland Yard.
Next, Kimberly Cunningham. She was distraught to find her sister's long-term boyfriend was abusing her kids, and she snapped. The first part of tonight's Women Who Kill collection, after the break.